Okay, let's get going. This is the PZC Regulatory Review Committee meeting of April 13th and called to order at 8:31 a.m. With members present, Aho, Ward, and Cooley. We have minutes from March 17th that we could approve today.
I move that we accept them as written.
Okay, moved by Ward.
Second
By Cooley. All in favor. So that's approved. No public comment waiting, Linda?
No, everyone that is logged in right now is part of the presentation under item 4A on your agenda.
Okay, we'll move right to that. Item 4A.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Attorney Joe Williams with Shipman and Goodwin. It's good to see all of you again. We appreciate your time in scheduling this meeting. As you will recall, we talked with you a few months ago about rezoning a property, and you gave us initial feedback about the kind of zoning you wanted to see there. We had another discussion where you made clear you would like to see a zoning district for the mixed-use transitional zone that has sort of a form-based element to it and looks at the design and the neighborhood elements and makes it truly transitional, focuses on middle housing, controls the building height to 2.5 stories maximum. So we have heard all of that and worked on it further and are back with you again today. With me is Chuck Lee from Clear Mountain Capital, whom you all know. And we are glad to have with us today Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio in Austin, Texas. And the reason we have brought Lee onto the team is about a year ago, I worked on a team presenting an apartment proposal in the town center of Simsbury. And the town of Simsbury had adopted shortly before we came in a town center code that is a form-based kind of code. And they had gone through, and this is a very important property to the town because it's right adjacent to their downtown retail area, immediately next to, if you know the area, the big property where the Hartford Symphony Orchestra does the outdoor concerts. And the town had gone through a charrette and had asked the community, what do we want to do here? They decided they wanted multifamily, and they all worked together and put this zone in place, which they were fortunate. They fairly quickly after putting the zone in place found a quality private sector developer who wanted to build under that zone and implement the town's vision. And it just all really went very well with no opposition, very short hearing, downtown partnership and local businesses supporting it. And I think the town found that that zone that was in place really did a great job of allowing enough structure and guidance to achieve the town's goals for what they wanted to see. And the developer also found it was flexible enough for them to do a great project and not be limited by certain restrictions. And so once we heard from you all that you wanted to look at that kind of code, I went back to look at that regulation that I had worked under and then found that it was drafted by Lee and his firm. And Lee and his firm have national experience and expertise and reputation in helping communities of all shapes and sizes around the country achieve their goals. So we thought he would be a great addition to the team. He's really helped us generate what we are excited to show you and believe are some terrific ideas for elements of a new zone. And so with that, I'd like to turn it to Lee to introduce himself and his firm to you. And then Lee and Chuck will walk you through some slides with images of some new things that we've been looking at.
Could I put?
You would throw up that
sure.
slide. That would be great.
Is it okay if I share the screen? Okay.
You should be all set.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks, guys. So we just wanted to give you a general sense that we work all over the place. Our firm was established in 2006. We've done a lot of this kind of code work before. That Simsbury code is the closest one to you and the only one in Connecticut that we've done, admittedly. We've been involved in some larger form-based code projects, the Buffalo Green Code, LA, Detroit, Cleveland, and now working in Atlanta on some form issues. But we also work in smaller places. Greenville, South Carolina right now is a current client that we're working with. Charlottesville, Virginia, Honolulu, and we get the opportunity to work on this kind of code about half of our code time. So I'm excited to be here and bring some form-based ideas to this discussion, because the transition that you're talking about, the desire for middle housing, the management of the form, the creation of walkability are all exactly what form-based codes are about. So this is pretty exciting for me. Thanks.
Great. So I'll just jump in here and I'll breeze through some of the earlier points that we've talked about before. The key thing we're trying to achieve, and this is based on the POCD objectives taken verbatim or in summary, is that what we're trying to do is provide the infill development and redevelopment of certain areas within town in support of compact workable districts, mixture of residential, office, commercial, residential, and other uses. And so in some of these areas, we've that are already intended for small scale office and residential, such as some of the parcels we've talked about before, we think would be appropriate for some of these form-based conversations. And so through this process, we think the creation of this new zone that will then allow developers like ourselves to come in there and develop the exact uses, the research, the office space, the municipal office space, potentially some retail, would serve as a very good natural amenity for the new residents are expected to come into the town over the next few years through the development of the surrounding technology park and other areas of growth within town. And so, and as part of it, though, we don't want to lose some of the elements that we've all talked about here, which is creating the human-scaled, walkable environments. There's been a push towards utilizing less vehicular modes of transportation, focusing more on biking, more like hiking trails, and walkability through public transport, particularly in the area of the Four Corners, where there is expected to be more density. We want to be focused on how do we create some zoning language such that developers like ourselves would be incentivized to build the appropriate amount of density to serve the transition, but also creates a more natural environment for the residents. And so just to reiterate some the key areas that we're talking about today, there are 3 identified areas in town that are the transitional areas. There's the area in the Four Corners, which we will talk about today. There's a small parcel down here, but right next to actually the town hall building across the street, diagonally. And then there's another parcel down here on Route 95 and Riverview Road. So while this designation does exist throughout town in different areas, the impact overall is in terms of the utilization of how to transition to the surrounding neighborhoods only impacts these 3 areas in particular. And I think Four Corners has the largest amount of considerations to think about through for this transitional use. And so focusing on the Four Corners, we've got here the parcels we've talked about before on the top left. This would include the currently the Gaffa Street Industrial Light Manufacturing Building. So overall, this use over time will become more of a transitional with office and a residential component, which is what some of these areas are currently zoned, where you have office zoning in the front, residential in the back. There are some components of these single-family homes that are along the Stores Road corner here that are also part of this transitional district, and along with this parcel here to the right of the to the east of the Cumberland Farms at the Four Corners. And so the application of this is, as you can see in this aerial view, is over the last few years, we've had the developments of the Four Corners and the creation of the PB3 district, which allowed for the higher density mixed use here. And the transition to the lower density residential to the north and the surrounding areas beyond the Four Corners is where we're starting to see how do we appropriately use the transitional use zone to help bridge the difference between what we're seeing to the south, which would include some of these new developments, and some of the expected new developments in the future at the four corners and bridging that to the northern side. And one thing I want to point out is that to the western edge of our site, there does exist a natural wetland boundary as well, or in this transitional area. This boundary here acts as a natural bounds of where we would see some of the residential and office developments move into over time. And so for this, Lee put this together. Would love to hear your thoughts as well as you think about how to really, what you've seen in terms of bridging that difference through the transitional use.
Thoughts from the committee about the site itself or this overall area in regard to how this kind of stepping away from the intensity of the four corners and the standard and adjacent projects towards those low density single family neighborhoods?
Yeah, Vera.
I think our original take on what we saw was we were concerned about the buffering. It didn't seem to be enough for the residential boundaries that have homes right that back up to you. So that would be one thing that I would like to be very much aware of is how you buffer this increased usage for that area.
Yeah. So I think, you know, from a form-based perspective, you try to put like forms near, you know, similar forms. So it could be that the form of buildings along that eastern boundary, especially the lower portion of the eastern boundary, where you can see there are kind of four holes in the forest there. Those are the closest houses. After that, it kind of changes a little. Thank you, Chuck. Those four houses need something adjacent to them that has a form similar to theirs. If you look at the site to the east of the Cumberland Farms, that one doesn't have those houses as nearby. It's a little different setting. Part of the site has already been cleared. And so perhaps different rules would apply in that place in order to capture sort of the form of the node as opposed to needing to buffer along that outside edge. The other point I would make is because the warehouse property is also in this node, and on the west, then you get the wetlands, there isn't really any reason to buffer the western edge of the property because presumably that would sit in the middle of the node eventually. The node will take up that tiny area that sits between the Timber Drive homes and the wetland northwest of the standard there. But other thoughts, Chair or others? Oh.
Just to expand on that, if you would, what would you have in mind for that? Is it the northern boundary or whatever it is where those four holes are, or residential homes are really backed up? I thought that the positioning of the buildings was way too close for that.
Well, that's
my memory of it anyway.
Yeah, well, we're moving a step back out, if you will. We no longer really have a site plan. We have a concept we're trying to implement on multiple sites through a district, right? So that's maybe a little bit different. So we're taking a little step back and trying to listen carefully here. My answer would be there need to be some trees as a buffer, but principally that whatever is near those homes has to look like a single family home. It has to basically be
you
have
some examples,
modest scale.
You have some
buildings.
examples of that to show us today?
We actually do.
Good.
So
that's what we're waiting
thank
for.
you, Chair, for getting us to that.
So maybe I'll skip over some of the interim slides here. Some of the key points that we were just trying to bring is that, Lee had a lot of experience with, these are the specific points from the POCD of what to expect and what to do as we create the zone. And he's, done all of these things for other projects. And so in terms of the scale of the type of residential we're thinking, right? So 2.5 stories, we've heard that loud and clear. we found different types of products where this would be that human scaled type of development, where, as you can see, this entryway here, this won't be very visible, if at all, from the neighbors, the four neighbors to the east. Part of the reason for that as well is that the neighbors to the east are actually sitting on a plateau that is higher than this entire site. And so what they'll see is the top of trees. And because these homes are now that they're lower in terms of their overall height, and also with the fact that they are on a 10 plus feet elevation difference lower than the four neighbors on the east, this won't be an impact to the character of what they will see as their neighborhood. So here's one example of a 2.5 story, a multifamily 2.5 story type building. Here's another example of it, which has character that is more similar to what we've seen in other parts of town. Again, it's multifamily. The key aspects of this is that we've also heard the commission say that we don't want to see garages completely down the street, and completely understand. And so with a design like this, as you can see, it does incorporate some of the garage features where it doesn't necessarily create additional parking spaces for every townhome or home that you build, but it does incorporate that component into it so that you still get the benefit of the fewer impervious surfaces through the parking spaces on the surface by incorporating that component here. And this creates the feel that's more of a walkable environment. You would have green spaces in and around these different areas that would create more of the residential feel, as opposed to maybe some of the other projects that we've seen proposed over the last 4 or 5 years. And so this is another design. And then another one would be something like this, where you do have, again, some parking components, but the key point that we want to point out here is that the activation component is pretty important in these designs. Because we do have residents that are living on both sides of this building, someone walking down the street would not feel like they're walking down a very sort of sterile environment where all they see are cars, and they don't see sort of the life that's going on within these homes. And so these are some of the ideas that we've seen, products that could work. And I think in terms of style and character, similar. We can obviously change some of the exteriors and windows and so forth to something that might be a little more appropriate for what we've seen in other parts of town. But generally speaking, this is the shape and form that we think could work. And keep in mind, this is in addition as a product type to the townhomes, right? And I know I've shown you townhomes before that do have the garage on the bottom, but we are redesigning that such that the garage would not exist anymore. It would just be 2.5 stories where you have living space, bedrooms, and then the master bedroom. So 2.5 stories for our future designs to come, right? And the other way we can provide a mix of product types is through this slightly different design called the big house, which does look like a large single family home, which is something that we have heard from the commission saying that would be interesting to have, is that basically instead of the inefficiency created by just single family homes, one every 5 acres, it wouldn't be a good use of land. It wouldn't create the number of units that we're looking to provide for the growing resident base in town. Some of these options here would be to create something that's more like it looks like a large single family home, but it actually accommodates different vehicles, accommodates different types of families, and a range of unit types from 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, however you want to design them. But overall, as someone walking down the street, you're not going to feel tremendously different from walking through a single family neighborhood, particularly as we get in some later sections. You'll see that Lee, as part of some of his experience, has created zoning regulations before that could help to regulate what a street looks like in some of these master plan developments. And of course, this is a picture that we actually took from the POCD. We are redesigning our other design, but overall the scale and shape is this is what we're generally thinking about, which is 2 2.5 stories, with the top floor being a partial story that would house either storage, or that's where the master bedroom will be, with the second floor as bedrooms and living space, and the ground floor as the dining and den, which would open up and provide the public space as defined in some of the guidelines, and also will bridge into some of the green areas that we anticipate will bring into the development across all the developments in the transition district. And so any comments on that initially? Yes.
I was wondering if you could run quickly down to the topography slide that's near the end of the deck there.
Sure, of course.
Just so that we could explain to Ms. Ward the extent of change. Thank you. So here you can see, Ms. Ward, the actual footprints of the houses, right? So the gray to the east there. Every one of those brown lines is 10 feet of change. So by the time we get to these units, they may well be 20 feet lower than the existing units. So part of this is that the view is not one-to-one seeing a house directly through the trees. It's actually seeing only sort of the rooftops through the trees as you look over. And that's why that 2.5 story form, I'm agreeing, is a really fine idea. So if we get smaller footprints for the buildings and those pitched roofs, I believe that this outside edge will be reasonably managed. I also wanted to point out that the first unit along Stores on both sides of Timber Drive there is allowed to use this transitional district too. And the first unit therefore might redevelop over time because the POCD does allow that. And given the intensity of the standard across the way, I could certainly see that happening over time.
I'm sorry.
I like, yeah. go
What
ahead.
are you saying about that? I'm sorry. What are you saying about that?
The first 2 lots, those 2, yes, thank you.
On Timber Drive?
On Timber are also designated on the POCD future land use map as having this transitional district or being allowed to use this transitional district. And so over time, given the intensity of what's across the street from them, they may become a more intense product than the 2 single family houses that are there today.
Just
Well, I must, sorry.
sorry, Gary, I just wanted to give you context. So the one that is on, that was highlighted, that's on the right side, that is Farino Realty. So that's an office use today. If that
Yeah,
helps
that's already an office, yeah.
you. Correct.
Thanks, Director.
Is that an empty lot on the other side of it? On the other side of Timber Drive?
No, there's a
Small
single
house.
family home there.
Small home.
Okay, it doesn't show a building in that lot. That's why I'm asking.
You're seeing the brown line through there, but the building actually sits on a very large lot with a brown line through the middle, which is actually the topography line.
The way
So-
this shakes out, I'm impressed with what the examples that you've shown us. I really like the last slide with the building on the left with the stone chimney and the brown exterior. For more sensitive places that we're going to get a lot of feedback from whatever is behind it, that we're building family homes. So I really like that one. And for maybe where you want to be more intense in your building and still keep it low key, I liked the examples that you showed on the first slide. So I think you've made big steps on this.
Yeah, I would agree with Vera that especially that second, the third slide, the residential, no, the next one, the next one after that. Yeah, I especially like those for being close to the other houses in the area. So,
Yeah,
think
I wasn't impressed with the bottom one so much, but I certainly like the one on the left.
mhm.
So the one on the bottom, or the notion of townhouses, might be important on this site only in certain locations where the topography is so steep that we cannot put a decent sized building
Mhm.
and we need to step. And so, Chuck, if you could just kind of highlight yes, that area. That area, because that is kind of the square portion of the site, but it's not flat, we may need to step townhouses away from Timber Drive down towards the wetland, right? Because the water and the movement of everything is going down. So if we don't want to have, a sort of massive cut and fill project here, townhouses are one of the most sensitive ways that we can produce a reasonable amount of housing stepping away from that direction. That doesn't mean that they have to go all the way up to the edge of the property. It's really just solving that problem of kind of stepping to the middle of the site, which could be a place for these larger buildings, because you can parallel the larger buildings with the topography. So going along, kind of northwest, southeast is where those larger buildings that were in the first slides could be. Does that make sense, Chair?
And I think the smaller the buildings, the closer they are to the ones on Timber Drive. The closer the buildings are to the form of Timber Drive, the less buffer you need.
Agreed. One of the things that we had noted in looking at this site is that actually, if you look further up towards the narrow leg of the Z there, there's actually one very large lot. It's probably was a double lot originally, but it was merged or never split in the original conception. And the two lots to the south of it along Timber Drive the houses are towards the front, again, because of the topography of the site. So there's actually 20 or 30 feet of change on those lots alone before you reach the property. So one of the things that we'll need to do is kind of think about how the form responds to that topographic change. And I don't think there's a reason to ask for more than 2.5 stories in these portions of the site, in the residential portions. We are going to talk a little bit about the commercial portions as well and show you some examples for that. But Chuck, could we show the image of kind of the page and the regulations? So we were thinking that these are the type of regulations, and admittedly, this is borrowed from one of my other codes. We haven't done anything specific to your issues, but so you're seeing the examples, the smaller building down there on the bottom in the left, the larger building on the right. The placement of those buildings in this particular case would be very particular, right? You want the end of the building towards the adjacent neighbors. I don't think we would be putting the longer building anywhere near that neighboring property boundary, right? So what you would be seeing looks like the back of a house, basically. The unit on the left could have 4 or 6 units, that smaller one. The unit on the right is actually set up in this particular case as townhouses. And I believe there are 4, if I'm counting the stoops right there. But that building could have been a multi-unit building instead of townhouse, in which case you might be, doubling the number of units. So these are 2 building types that we can regulate. We regulate the massing. If you look in the massing there, you're seeing 2.5 stories and 35 feet, a very traditional residential height. But we are controlling the top plate height. That's the height of the wall before the roof starts. And so that's a very important element of keeping things down and in scale, right? So at 25 feet of top plate height, the building is now, if there's 20 feet of grade change in between, you're only seeing the roof when you look straight out from the building. You won't actually see the lower portions of the building or the parking that might be adjacent to it. The kind of pinkish color in the drawing is activation of the building. That means that those would be portions of the building that would not be allowed to have just parking and just garage doors on them. We can use that tool to manage the amount of garage doors that are facing the street or a side street or a parking area, and making sure that we're getting activation along the building where we care about it, which is on the street facing side, which is where our walkability is, right? We're trying to create a great street up through the center of this site. And so, key to that is really what is facing that street. That's what will generate the walkability there. Story height also.
One comment
Yeah.
I'd have about this is that I think if I were writing form-based regulation for middle housing, I wouldn't have a building that's 150 feet long.
This primary street maximum width is probably a little bit long for your setting. For the setting that it was written for, that's half a block. And
Yeah, we don't want something that large, I don't think.
understood.
And also, you talk about not having plain facades. That's kind of a plain look on that where H goes.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It is just a regulatory drawing, admittedly. And you're not seeing anything which might be an additional layer about activation. Maybe in this particular case, the porch should have run across the entire front of the building facing the street. We can talk about how those tools might apply. When you were looking at the examples, if we can pick out those elements that you like from the examples, some of which you've already commented on, then we can ensure that those kinds of elements show up in the new buildings. That's fundamentally the beauty of the form-based code is if you can tell us what the form is that we're trying to conform to. The chair's already suggested not this long, that's fine. More articulation of the facade. All of those kinds of things are possible to regulate. We're showing you kind of a tiny little excerpt here, just to give you a sense. But it's important to also mention, windows and doors. Walkability comes from the comfort of walking along a street that you feel is not a hidden thing. It's not blank walls. It's not just parking, not just garage doors, but that people are, actually in their rooms inside and are aware of what's going on the sidewalk. That's what provides the perception of safety in these settings. And so activating those walls, any walls that face the street, quite important. If you want to have more blank walls internal or to the rear facing parking, that's something that form-based codes often don't regulate as much, right? A much lighter touch on the portions of the building that are not facing the street, so that we're really controlling what we see from the public realm.
I have a couple of comments.
Yeah.
First of all, I really appreciate the thought that you have put into all of this and thinking about our concerns and the things that we're trying to do in this area. But one question that I have, you mentioned Simsbury's code earlier.
Yes.
Are you talking about the Simsbury Center code?
The town center code,
Okay.
yes.
That's really interesting. And I definitely think that's something that we as a commission should look at. One of the things that I find interesting about it that would be really, I think, helpful for us is that this is sort of accessory to their regular zoning code. So instead of rewriting the entire zoning code, they simply created a form-based code that applies to this particular area. And I think that's something that we should think about as a tool that would be really useful for us, especially in this area. So instead of trying to create form-based code across all of our districts, which would be great, but would probably take far too much time.
It would take several years, yes.
Yeah, this is a way that we could accomplish what we're trying to do, and think about it actually as like a test to see if we can pull off a more form-based code for a particular situation. And this is perfect for that, frankly, because trying to figure out how to create this kind of transition zone in a town like Mansfield that has a lot of problems, not problems, but constraints, like where is our sewer system, where is our water, how close are you to campus, who are you trying to encourage to live in this particular district, what kind, and it's access to transportation. So that's definitely something that we should think about, I think. And I think that this approach so far, what you've talked about, I know you're trying to particularly look at this one site, but for a larger thing that we can do, I think this is valuable. This is a really good idea.
Yeah, Vera.
I agree completely. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we ought to, when we're talking about this special regulatory section, we ought to consider that other property that they're building that would back up to Greenfield Lane or whatever it is, because that's a very sensitive spot there. So we would really want to think about that when we're thinking about this.
Does someone have a link to that Simsbury code?
Sure. Yep. I can put it in the
Can you
chat.
send that around? Or yeah.
Yeah.
The one thing different about the Simsbury Code, just be forewarned, is that it does regulate based on the actual frontage. So it is particular to the street that you're on.
Yes.
And this one, because of the multiple settings, those three settings that we're really talking about, even within the Four Corners setting, you've got kind of three settings. This property and the adjacent warehouse property are kind of one idea. The two fronting properties on Timber Drive are, another portion of an idea. And the one east of Cumberland Farms is, quite different again. We need to leave enough flexibility in this code, but make it do the right things in all of those settings.
Yep.
So we can use simple ideas about form, like, are you within 50 feet of the house? If so, then you have to do these things. If you're more than 100 feet from the house, maybe you don't have to do those things anymore. We can look at some of those ideas that turn themselves on and off based on the context. And that is one of the beauties of this kind of, it's really more of a toolkit for doing your site design than it is necessarily a sort of singular monolithic zone. So I think that the other piece we'd like to show you, and I don't mean to cut short the conversation of residential, but I do want to remind you that we kind of need this transition. This piece that would be the office or mixed use in the front is a key part of this transition as well, along stores. And so, Chuck, if you wanted to talk about these a little bit, and then I'll talk about the page that goes with them.
Sure. So the concept we're seeing here is, so in terms of scale and size of some of the commercial uses, and because this is fronting Stores Road, it would make sense for the street view to correspond well with the projects across the street and the other more dense developments to serve as that bridge. So what we would anticipate is, from seeing a 3 to 4 story building across the street, we can transition that to our side of the street, to a 3-story building with a pitched roof that starts to look less dense, less intense in terms of height, more walkability in terms of creating the activation space along Stores Road with large open windows, and as Lee mentioned, can be regulated in terms of how much of that activation you see. And so we can incorporate some of those and basically have this serve as the start of the transition from PB3 into the back area. And we think this also makes sense because the site currently already is split zoned, where we have PO1 use in the front. And so creating the ability to do something like this, like 3-story, that is keeping with the character of the community, we think that could then open up behind it to now then transition down further to the 2.5 stories and smaller single family to the north. So wanted to get some initial thoughts on.
What do we have across the street? Is it 4 stories or 5? It's 4, I think, right?
I think
It's a mix depending on where you are. It's 3 to the furthest west. There is a 4, and then the 5 is really embedded where the parking garage is.
Right, it's
towards the
behind.
back.
Right. But facing the street is either 3 or 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's quite strange on the other side of the street chair as well, because of the large sewer easement that sits there. And so there's a very odd thing going on with a sort of double sidewalk and some other challenges particular to that site that we don't have those same challenges here, but we might choose to try to make Storrs Road look like a consistent room by taking some of the ideas about the location of the buildings into account as we think about this side of the road.
Yeah, Vera.
So in thinking about retail and your mixed use, I thought we talked about offices and small offices and that sort of thing, not a big showroom, not a large restaurant. Is that what you're thinking?
We can definitely restrict uses as well. Form-based codes do touch on use, while they rely heavily on form to manage the impacts of that use. They do regulate use. So whatever you are comfortable with, it would make some sense to me to potentially have a daycare or a coffee shop, or
Right.
you know, something of modest intensity. Everybody's favorite lately is a bakery, you know, which is also a coffee shop and also a whatever. So there are certainly a variety of uses. We would regulate them in some ways based on the size of the tenant, right? So the square footage of the tenant kind of changes things. If you if you have a bakery and you know it is the size of a typical Starbucks, it's going to be very different from the kind of bakery that bakes bread and sends it out by the train load to some grocery store chain, right? So the use gets also managed by the form. So we don't have to be, if we are careful with regulating the form, we don't have to be quite so worried about the use, but that's a conversation that we can have as we get a little further along. Office is definitely the intended dominant use.
I'm just thinking of traffic generation and trying
As
to
well
see-
you should.
Yeah.
We think there is a big issue to be worked out for this northern side about where the entrance might be, whether there are multiple entrances, thinking about the properties as a whole for this node and how that might be managed.
That bring up
so
one
there's-
point as well. Sorry to interrupt you. I think to that point, I think in terms of traffic, there's having that this component, and we're not necessarily requiring it or having that as part of it, but I think some retail offerings do often serve as an amenity to the surrounding communities. And I think over time, as we make a more inclusive of different use types within a certain area that's walkable, I think what I would pose is that over time, if I don't need to drive to the Starbucks in town center and there's a coffee shop across the street, I would walk across the street. And therefore, overall, I think over time, the traffic will be reduced if we incorporate a mix of uses such that residents can live, they can work, and they can play within this confines of the community. And so that's something I wanted to consider as well. And that's why it's not that I particularly like retail. I think retail is difficult option to have at this state of the economy and where we're going. But I think it does provide that purpose for the residents to feel like they don't need to drive 10, 20 minutes or 10 minutes to the local bakery, as Lee had mentioned.
I think that's a great thought about the usage. I think it should be really utilized by your own development area residents. So it would be personal and small and that sort of thing. Just a personal preference. I think brick looks old. I don't like the brick building.
Okay, that's no problem. We'll change that.
Just a personal.
Okay.
Good to
And
hear
I
those
like
things,
the
though.
brick, actually, but that's I like the brick. I feel like it's something a little different myself.
I like the brick too.
It looks like Yukon.
Well, that one does, but I feel like I feel like we need some sort of different, Greg Lewis, remember, he was always saying, maybe we do need a little bit of a modern look, and it doesn't always have to be this sort of New England clapboard, that's okay as long as it's well designed, right? We don't want, I don't want a brutalist building there, but this I like with all the windows, you know, I just feel like it's, but
Kind of looks like a factory.
Yes,
it has, it,
it's a loft. It's, you know,
Yeah.
it's really, it's trying to look like a factory converted to a loft, for sure.
Very New England.
Jennifer, your point is well taken. Things like the windows, those are things we're going to regulate. So
Yeah.
we can actually come fairly close to making certain we get a building, you know, like this by turning that dial up, by setting that standard high. It doesn't need to look this glassed in on every side. The side that faces the parking doesn't necessarily, the parking would be behind this building as you see it from stores. That helps with a couple of things. It helps with the queuing off of stores. If everybody was coming to the office at the same time in the morning, for example, because you're queuing into the site before you're going back to the parking back behind. That idea of the parking rooms that would sit back behind these buildings, and so those larger gray areas with the little P's in them would be an example of how the parking might be handled on the site. So those smaller building types that you were seeing would be around that yellow area near the top. And only the very front of the property would have this kind of more commercial, flat roofed or pitched roofed, really full on 3-story look. So it's just a frontage along the road that is similar to the frontage across the way. I haven't necessarily seen the elevations of the standard, but I'd be curious about those in the long run. Those might help us figure out what some of these elevations might have to look like and what some components would be. And I know you've, worked hard to get that, site plan worked out already. And then as you went further back into the site, of course, the missing middle, kind of goes, away from the existing edge with the Timber Drive residence, and is really either to the west of the road or within that squarer part, the center of that squarer part of the site where the sort of orange color is. So this is just kind of showing how the transition might be thought through. The lightest touch on the outside, and especially the deepest green buffer where the houses are the closest, and pulling the buildings, down to the street. We did want to show you a little something about streets. If I could, Chuck, just the one slide on streets so that we can help them understand how that can be regulated as well. So these are just some examples of a variety of types of things you might see on the property. So there is a small internal street in that upper picture, right, with the buildings along it. This is not the portion back at the edge of the property. This is the key street that is running up through the property, potentially. The form-based code can ask for streets, sidewalks, lane widths, all those kinds of elements. And then in the 2 images below are some other kinds of things you might see, like a pedestrian passage that goes between buildings to parking behind, for example. And a multi-use trail like you might see coming along the edges of the wetland area. So just to kind of give you a sense, we can regulate all of these things to be comfortable that we are getting the right cross sections and the right relationship between the public realm and the buildings themselves.
I have one question. So we're looking at the mixed use transitional zone, and you identified 3 other locations in town that this could apply to. So, I mean, this it seems that what you're presenting here is specifically for this Four Corners mixed use transitional. How does
I think the street would be applied in all of them.
Yeah.
The trail may not apply to some of the others, but the pedestrian passage would. So 2 out of 3 of the images, you're right. The one is particular to the fact that we have those beautiful wetlands. They attach to the town property, so they give us an amazing opportunity, maybe, you know, to stub out there somewhere so that a connection could be made and a loop could be made eventually that would come along the wetlands and through the town and then through this project. That one is particular to this, although I haven't looked at those other sites, and you have so many wetlands in town that
Yes, we do.
it wouldn't surprise me if this condition existed in some of the other settings as well.
I think we talked about this at a staff level, looking at, so from zoning, you can't look at things site specific, it seems, but can you incorporate natural resources? Like, if the site is sloped, like this you have different elevations here. So this site, you know, you might be able to do this, but if you are applying this to the other site that doesn't have those slopes or has more wetlands, how do you incorporate that into the code? I mean, you've got wetlands regulations, but those, you know, we know that we have a 150-foot upland review area, and you just have to prove that there's going to be no significant impact on wetlands
From that area.
But that doesn't cover, that's not a hard setback. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. So you can put a hard setback in this set of regulations if you feel that in these pilot areas you know have some kind of stomach for that. But I would rather see, let's not take the wetland side. Let's take the side with the single family homes. The most important thing is the distance between the house. So if the distance between the house is flat or up, it's very different than if it is down.
Correct.
Right? Downslope is the best condition to have, you know, single family houses. So we would have to look at the set of sites to get this set of rules right. But sometimes that means there's 3 rows on the table. You know, the buffer if it's, you know, basically flat, the buffer if the slope is more than this, the buffer if the slope is, you know, like that. So upslope and downslope are sometimes regulated differently. If you have ever seen the Hollywood Hills in LA, we've dealt with some really interesting steep slope ideas for building in the Hollywood Hills. So we've probably got enough expertise based on that to bring some ideas to the table at least and do a first version of this. I think that same sort of context sensitive approach applies to the wetlands. You know, if you don't have wetlands, you get more flexibility than if you do. And it's just the simple context of your site. We don't want to treat every site as though it were exactly the same. The physical conditions will be quite different.
Right.
So we just need to make sure that, so typical zoning, right? It just says this many feet for side yard setback and, you know, whatever.
Yeah,
and
right.
it doesn't have any context tools embedded in it. So we just need to make sure that when we're building our tables, we're building those context tools in so that we feel comfortable with them. So that kind of, you know, if you go change the POCD map and now you have 4 or 5 of these transitional areas because this one worked so well, you know, you'd like to see it in some other places. We need to make sure that we've written the kinds of rules that will cover a variety of places. You're right, zoning has to be somewhat blind to specific sites, but it is great to be given specific sites to test the rules against.
Because I think we should be, you guys are the experts, right? But I think it would be great if we could be context sensitive, because that's what's hard about zoning. And my other question is, when you're looking at, so you're doing, you're looking at existing structures on another person's private property as a setback. So how, because that's the other thing we don't do with zoning, we do a setback from the property line. So does that take away someone else's property rights if we're just saying, okay, you have this house, but doesn't that limit what they can do in the future?
No, so don't think of it as a setback, please. So
Okay,
let's call
all right.
it something different.
Gotta switch
So
my
it is,
lens.
it is actually, it's a transition. It results in a setback, but it's a variable transition that is sensitive to what's going on nearby. And so Ms. Ward, brought up this issue initially, how close are you going to be? Am I going to see you? Those are really important issues to those neighbors.
Yeah.
And the most important issue is not how many people are going to be on the site overall. The most important issue for them is when I stand on my back porch, what's right there, and if it's 3 stories tall and flat roofed, I'm like, absolutely no. So we have to be able to talk to people like that about what we're proposing here and make them feel comfortable that we have a reasonable transition. Transitions exist in lots of codes. They're usually called buffers. Sometimes they're called screening. There are lots of tools for transitions, including manipulating the building, using open space, and using vegetation. And all of those might be appropriate here. You're probably using these tools already in some portion of your code where commercial abuts with residential, for example. We often have some kind of a transition. So this is just expanding those transition tools. And instead of triggering them because I have this zoning against this zoning, we're actually triggering them saying, no, it's really the existing condition that is making that happen, right? It's that this is close to this. Would it stop the adjacent house from building closer? No, it just makes this one non-conforming, but nothing would change about it. It's already in place, right?
Yep. And then my final, and I know Paul is very familiar with this because I know his sister lives in Cambridge, Mass, and he brought that up once. But when I was in grad school, I lived in Burlington, Vermont in a triple decker. I lived in Jamaica Plain in a triple decker. My mother grew up in a triple decker in the mill town of Lewiston, Maine. And, you have the front porch and then you have a back porch and you have a little green space. And I don't know what the density, those areas are very dense, but they're very residential. And that form is one is really near and dear to my heart, and because of all those things. But is that something that we could?
So in many of our codes, we regulate something that we usually call outdoor amenity space, and we make certain that there is some somewhere. In a more urban setting, outdoor amenity space might be on top of a parking garage or on top of the building for the views, for the, whatever. But it's typically private to the building, right? It's semi-public space. It's not full-on public space. So the triple deckers that you're describing, the backyard in many cases is fenced, right? And private to that particular unit. That's a great model of outdoor amenity space, but it is totally private to the unit. One of the questions is, would it be more useful in the long run if it were private space for everyone in all of the units? Dog park being the most recent example, which we see in almost every multi-unit building, is some place to walk the dogs. That's a shared amenity for the entire building. We don't all just walk the dogs in our little backyard. We actually want the larger fenced in play space where our dogs can run and whatever else and not bother our neighbors. So yes, we should talk about some of those kinds of spaces and what we could do. Again, we've not got down to anything that could be considered really a site plan. So it's important that you give us these big idea concepts and that we talk about those and try to get them into the rule set so that they would apply to everybody on all of these sets of land.
I think the other thing about Cambridge, I think the other point that Jennifer is trying to make is that a place like Cambridge can be very dense and not have huge buildings. So
totally true. If you look at an aerial photo of Cambridge, or for that matter of Charleston or Savannah, it is amazingly dense. And yet, because of the vegetation, because of the placement, the organization, So definitely. So
I was,
yes,
I was in Savannah last week, and
Were you?
I like a lot of what I saw there.
Did you
Very
peek
densely
between the
populated,
houses? Yeah,
very
did you peek
densely
between the
populated,
houses and
but not big apartment buildings.
no,
Lots
no,
of
no.
little buildings.
Yes, yes, in and under the trees because the
And the
trees
other
are
thing is that they have 24 parks, or yeah, 24 squares set
But
out by Oglethorpe.
back to the private open space. I
yes.
think people or whatever, your yard, right? People here are used to having their yard. I would raise a family in a triple decker. Like if we were gonna, live in a city, I would totally do that. But I want my yard, but that's maybe just my personal thing. I don't know what people think about like the yard thing in this area.
That's part of housing choice, right? So there are some people who would say having a yard is a pain in the butt because it's not big enough to mow. I have to own a weed whacker and go out there every 6 weeks when it gets knee high and, whack it down. And others would say, oh, it's my garden, my tomatoes, my this, my, right?
Right.
So there are choices, and some of that should be left to the private marketplace to figure out whether the building with the yards outsold the building without the yards, but some is in the public interest, and so we just need to talk about what the balance of that is and how to set things up. I think that there will be some of each kind of space. There will be some green spaces along streets, as yard spaces there, et cetera, that may be shared spaces, and maybe that's enough shared space, and other spaces can be more privatized. The buildings you are seeing are mostly relying on porches and balconies as some of the private amenity space. So you were seeing a fair amount of that in the designs that Chuck was sharing. And those are worth considering as part of this, package of things, is that they are being provided some space that is typically private to each unit. Only other thing I wanted to say about this is a table of contents, just to remind everybody that we not only have the districts, those kinds of standards you were seeing for residential or mixed use buildings, but we might have our own table of land use. And this is where we could, turn the dials for this use is okay and that one's not. We would have potentially our own standards for parking, landscaping, signs, outdoor display and storage, only if the transition requires it. So for example, if you don't want the commercial to look quite as commercial, you can manage the signage, and that will make a big difference in people's impression of it. If it is mostly for the people who live in the place, they will know it exists. And you don't need the same kind of freeway sign, that's like, here I am, for everybody driving by on stores. If that's not the intent, then modifying some of the signage provisions to provide for more modest signage is completely appropriate. And managing things like outdoor display and storage, basically in residential areas, we don't want to see any of that. So making sure that whoever the tenants of this building are, they are not outside of the bounds of the buildings in whatever their activities are. So yes, this is shown as a table of contents as a little standalone code. In many client communities, parts of this could be reusable, and you could begin to add more districts for other kinds of settings. If you want to manage the form in other settings beyond the transition. So this could become a model for slipping something into as you build new districts in the community to implement the plan. And could be really helpful in providing a sort of first leg up into this world by piloting this on those three key areas.
And one part of the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about this page as well is because it would help us to understand if we're heading in the right direction, right? Because we can craft something like this, or Lee can utilize expertise for this. But we would want to hear from the commission of whether or not this is the right approach to it, because I think for this meeting, I don't think we've talked about what is the right. I think Ms. Cooley mentioned earlier that it would be interesting to include it into the zoning as Simsbury had in the past. And so wanted to get some feedback on if this approach, what we're suggesting here, would be appropriate, and do we have can we proceed to do something like this so that we can start implementing some of this into some of the parcels we discussed today.
Well, I like the direction this is going. You know that a pre-application meeting is not binding, whether we like something or not, but certainly from my point of view, you're definitely going in the right direction. I only wish we had started 2 years earlier as a commission.
It
Now
might have been nice to have across the street for the standard, for sure.
I won't make any comment on that, but I'm glad that we're here now and looking at some transition for the future. So yeah, this is pre-application, but I like what I'm seeing.
I too, and I totally agree with you, Paul. I wish we'd been there a couple of years earlier, but we can do what we can do now, and I think we really need to work on this.
Thanks for that link, Luann. I'm going to study the Simsbury one.
So Lee, do you want to go into a little bit of the process in which you work with certain towns that you've worked with before?
Yeah, so typically, it would take us probably about 60 days to prepare something for Chalk and Joe's review. Have to survive that first before we hand it over to staff. Normally, we would go one round with staff before we actually present to you. It's possible that a director will want to, share this with you immediately at that stage, and that would be fine. We would normally walk you through the code at that point and talk to you about what each of the districts produced, talk to you about the general standards and about the land uses that would be allowed. So this would just turn into an extension of the conversation we've just been having, except that you would have had the metrics to look at and be able to comment on those during a discussion at some point in time. So, overall, you could aspire to having something like this in place in something that's counted in months rather than years, I believe. Part of that depends on how well we do with the first draft. We've been listening today. We would continue our conversation with staff, of course, who I think has a fair amount of experience interpreting how both the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council might view things, and so can continue to help provide us insight as we draft. And then we would be bringing it forward for your consideration. And then at some point, it would become something that we would propose to add as a text amendment, right, to the existing code, not site specific, just a text amendment. And following that, presuming it got adopted, then site plans could be drafted and prepared that met that, and a specific proposed development could come forward.
That sounds like a good way to go.
So one question that I had, kind of taking off from Luann's comment earlier about, really kind of focusing in on the transitional parcels in the Four Corners area. So kind of being, and to what Jennifer was saying, being context specific. One thought that I had, I know, Joe, you started this entire presentation really kind of giving the history of the Storage Center Special Design District and, kind of how that came about. And while I wasn't here when that was done, I can go back and verify, but I'm pretty sure that one of the things that they actually did was I think they came forward simultaneously, like kind of concurrently with the text amendment to create the district and also the map amendment to apply it to downtown. And so again, I can go back and look at that, but one of the things I would, and I don't know, Joe and Chuck, if this is something you're interested in, is given the parcels that you were highlighting, there aren't a great number of landowners that you're talking about here. And this may be something that you want to talk to those other property owners about and say, are you interested in this? And, you know, in terms of, you know, kind of collaborating, and then, you know, you may be ready to move forward on your piece. They may be lag behind a little bit, but just a thought in terms of, so that it's more holistic and you're looking at all the, you know, kind of considering, I can't remember how many properties there are. I don't think there are.
Probably 10 at most.
I was gonna say, I think 5.
Between
I'm counting,
all of
like,
them.
you know, maybe if you include our
The
fire
Four Corners
station,
ones,
the
you're
one
probably
next
right.
to it, 7.
Hmm.
You know, and so kind of trying to look at that and come up with it and say, okay, you know, what are we looking at here? And again, that just to throw that out there as an idea, because, you know, it's something that I know, Jen, you know, we talk about special design districts a lot. We wanted one for all of Four Corners years ago. We couldn't get property owners to work together, but maybe if we're only dealing with 6 or 7 parcels, and, you know, again, if you take the kind of the Charles Smith Way, Hanks Hill Road transition, the 195 transition out of it, and just focus on that Four Corners area, that may become a little bit more doable, and Lee, to your point, serve as kind of a model for how you can then tackle other areas in the future.
Yes, especially that Cumberland Farms parcel that's east there is quite large, quite
Yep.
developable in the scheme of things. And we'd want to know that the rules produce the right answer on that site as well.
And we can provide you with the contact information for that, for at least that property. I think we're familiar with most of them, but that one we're definitely familiar with.
Okay,
Contact information for.
please do.
And
And we'll definitely talk about that and take a look at it.
Yeah, I will say the one thing on that large piece Lee just mentioned, the residential neighborhood that backs up to it, Greenfield Lane, has been very vocal in the past when any concepts have come out for that property. They're large lot, large houses, and they get very nervous when anything is contemplated. So I just wanted to throw that out there at the beginning of this. I think we heard some concerns from Timber Drive when you did your initial pre-app. I would expect the same thing from Greenfield.
Tenfold.
I agree. So I know we probably need to, are there other items on the agenda, Linda? Can I just add one kind of, so in the planning and zoning commission and planning and development department's capital budget, this is not related to this. Maybe we should probably make sure we're done with this agenda. And then I just have one comment I'd like to make.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we're done with this segment.
Okay,
Go ahead.
in the planning and zoning, in the planning and development department's capital improvement budget is a Hunting Lodge Road neighborhood plan.
Mhm.
To me, what this form-based zoning would be a way that we could look at that neighborhood with the loss of Goodwin School. However, it's not clear that the council will include that in the budget. So I think that if that's something that the Planning and Zoning Commission wants to do, I think you know, it's in the town manager's budget. So I don't. Linda's talking.
Linda's just getting a little nervous because it's a special meeting.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
this is-
It's a different.
So
Sorry. Okay, I'll be
that's
quiet.
a future meeting discussion is
Yeah.
what I would say.
Okay,
Hold that thought.
yeah, I will. That's a
Okay, I think we're-
communication or under other, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted, because it is a special meeting, I can't add agenda items. So it's, you know, future meeting discussion of Hunting Lodge Road and West Campus and potential of applying something like this to that area.
We might find a transitional area over there
Well,
in a future meeting.
To be clear, there are other transitional areas identified. They're not mixed use transitional areas. They're compact
Compact
residential
residential.
transitional areas. And so those are identified on our future land use map. And honestly, I think there are some compact residential areas, not even transitional, that I think, you know, our plan says all along that compact residential does not mean, you know, it's apartment buildings, that there are many forms that can happen in compact residential, including cottages, the large house concept that Chuck presented today, where you have, it looks like a large single family house, but is actually, you know, multiple units inside. So I
And
think
triple deckers, maybe with private opens, maybe the yard, that the triple decker with the yard, right? I mean, maybe that could work
we're
there.
gonna have a triple decker district just for Jen.
And we don't need the 150,000 to discuss zoning in that area. We can change the zoning without the grant, although the grant would be nice.
Well, you need a lot of planning though.
And you need, yeah,
Absolutely a lot of planning.
and you need someone who is experienced in doing that type of coding. You know,
This is
I
not
think
cheap.
what, yeah.
But
what
I
Lee
think
was presenting today, so-
my point is that I don't think the town council can veto our discussion of that road by withholding the funds.
No.
But
We
you're
can-
not
we
going
can-
to have that discussion without the funds in a meaningful way. But we need.
We're
to
going to have
discuss
the we're going to have the discussion even without the funds.
So let's not get, we're getting sidetracked here. I think
We're getting over our
discussion-
skis here.
Yeah, I think the point is that transitional districts, you know, right now today's focus was really on the transitional districts or at the edges of Four Corners, and how do you make that transition from that density and intensity to the single family neighborhoods. There are other transitional districts where this approach may be the best way to go. And that's something that, you know, we'll have to continue to look at as a committee, commission, and staff.
Well put.
All right.
Anything else? Anything else today?
Thank you all for the discussion. We enjoyed it and appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
We're adjourned
you.
at 9:47.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Linda, should we stay on this meeting or we'll go to the next meeting?
I think Joe's already left.